over to the main show. Welcome to Anna Danielsson, who is a reader in education at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. She's got a PhD in physics and specialises in physics educational research. Her research interests are really centred around issues about gender, power and identity within the context of teaching and learning, science and technology, and she's published extensively in this area, so I won't even start to mention any publications, but you can check them out. She's currently involved in 3 research projects, and again I won't give you the information about all of those, but I'll just mention one that she's PI for, which is called Power, Knowledge and Identity in Science Technology Classrooms, Teachers' Enactments of Disciplinary Discourses as Establishing Inclusion and Exclusion. So it's great to have you here. Thank you for coming, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me. It's really great to be here, and great to see so many people here. Great to see a few fellow scientists in the group too. So it's going to be really interesting to discuss my work with you. The topic of today's talk then is Masculinities in Higher Education Physics. This was work carried out at the physics department actually within a research group focused on physics education research. But currently I'm working at the Department of Education and the Center for Gender Research at Uppsala University. Just to set the scene a bit for this talk, what is sort of the usual story about physics? Well, often we hear things such as that Marina, one of the informants in my study, I did an interview study, more about that later. But this is quite common sort of among physics students. Marina said, I never got any boundaries in school and talked to people and wanted to know what the most difficult education was. And then people agreed that engineering physics was definitely the toughest thing you could study. So she chose physics because physics is considered so difficult. That might not be so very common, but we often hear stories about physics being a difficult discipline to study. There is this perception of physics being a hard discipline, something that's difficult, and that's not for everyone really. Tor, a PhD student I interviewed, when I asked him why he was in physics, it was pretty obvious to him that physics was the place to be. He said, it can't get any more fascinating than that. That's just a simple fact. So, this idea of physics then as the most fundamental science, the most fascinating science, Tor in this case is talking about work he'd been involved in that was about building, as he explained it to me, a machine where they could see pictures of, where they could see individual atoms. And it's just a fact that science do not get more fascinating than that. So physics as difficult, physics as the most fundamental science, and another part of this story is obviously that it's a discipline dominated by men. When we think of a physicist, something like this often pops into mind. This is drawings from children, from one of these Draw a Scientist assignments. These are 5th graders who've drawn these. And one of the interviewees in my study, a PhD student in physics, she had a very similar description of the sort of traditional physicist. When I asked her who she would define as a physicist, she said, spontaneously then, a professor at our department who's just about to retire. He feels like a physicist. He's of the old school, done physics and then graduate school and so on. It's like the spontaneous thought of a physicist. I don't know if but it feels more like older men, which sounds really sad that you feel that way. But so here is a young woman done doing a PhD in physics, and this is her image of the physicist. So on one hand, gender within the discipline of physics is, of course, very visible. Sweden might be considered one of the most equal countries in the world, yet if you look at physics, the male dominance is almost total. Less than 10% of the physics professors in Sweden are women today. This doesn't necessarily imply that gender masculinity does become visible within the discipline of physics, given that Halberstam has argued that masculinity largely can be seen as non-performative. So just because there is a lot of men in physics doesn't mean that we might notice that there are gender in the discipline. In particular, also since the discipline of physics so often is seen as not affected by social structures, as sort of the epitome of the rational, objective discipline, where things such as gender shouldn't matter at all. So that's sort of part of the background story, and because of this dominance of men in physics are often then assumed to have sort of an unproblematic relationship to their chosen discipline. In the seminal work by Kim Thomas, where she has looked at constructions of gender within university physics and university English, she writes, "For these men, these physicists and the physical scientists, self-image was concerned with the particular nature of one's abilities and the sort of job one could do with them. It was rarely concerned with one's identity as a man, as opposed to a scientist. The two were one and the same thing. There was, as we might expect, no conflict between the two." So men then are assumed to have an unproblematic relationship to the discipline of physics. But in today's talk, I would like to sort of go beyond that surface of this assumed unproblematic relationship, and also the often assumed problematic relationship between women and physics, and sort of break up that dualism and look for the nuances in how people construct their identities as physicists. And Helena Pettersson, she has argued that it's not enough. If we want to critically study gender dynamics within the sciences, it's not enough to look at the women, as so often has been done. The focus is often sometimes on women's accomplishments in this male-dominated STEM disciplines, but even more on women's struggles to fit into these disciplines. But in order to fully understand the gender dynamics in these disciplines, it's of course also important to look at the gender that is the norm within these disciplines and scrutinize constructions of masculinity. So what I'm going to try to do today is to explore how university physics students constitute the practice of physics as enacted in student and research laboratories, and how in these contexts they can then be understood as enacting both social class and gender, with a focus then on the construction of masculinities. And the reason I've chosen to focus on the laboratory is that that is such a central part of the physics practice. I should also mention that I am an experimental physicist myself, so that also sort of fed into that choice to focus on the laboratory. Also because then that was a physics context where I could be seen as an insider, where I could have more sort of nuanced conversations with these PhD students and undergraduate students. Just something briefly about the empirical data for this study. In total, I interviewed 22 students. 13 of them were doing an undergraduate degree program in physics, sort of a Bachelor of Science in physics. And I interviewed them about their experiences of doing laboratory work in the student laboratory. And I also interviewed 9 master's and PhD students, and we talked then about their experiences of working in research laboratories. This is a study that was done in Sweden. It took place at a research-intense Swedish university, quite traditional Swedish university. And at this particular university, the physics research had traditionally been very much focused on experimental physics. But today there is a wide variety of different kinds of physics research going on. So there is theoretical physics, there is experimental physics, there are more sort of applied experimental physics as well. So a wide range of different sort of physics available both in terms of research and educations at this university. At the time of the study, about 75% of the undergraduate physics students were men, and about 95% of the physics professors were men at this university. This undergraduate degree program, then the undergraduate students I interviewed were enrolled in, is a very study-intense program. Maybe not so high status in terms of that it's difficult to get into, But very high attrition rate. Many people drop out of this attrition rate of at least around 50%. And very study intense in that they have full days of study. So they have lectures, they got tutorials, got laboratory work. They are at a university studying, doing physics, well, almost all the time, to be honest. I'm going to be very brief when it comes to the theoretical foundation for this work. I'm happy to talk about that more later, but I thought what's more interesting is to look at empirical data, so I'll spend the majority of the talk with that. But just to sort of set the scene for what kind of theoretical landscape I find myself in. As I said, this is a study carried out within the realm of physics education research. It's based in an understanding of learning that draws on situated learning theory to view learning as the construction of identities, which stands in contrast to how learning within very much of physics education research is focused on the acquisition of conceptual and procedural knowledge. So identity becomes then a key concept within this work. And here, identity is looked at then as being related to a competent and convincing performance of a particular role. It's defined not just internally by the individual, but externally by the group's inclusive or exclusive attitude to that individual. So this combination of performance and recognition as being sort of the pillars of identity construction. In the work I'm presenting today, masculinity then also is an important analytical category. And this then, for me, highlights how not only women, but also men then are positioned within the physicist community's context of power. And hopefully this can serve to unpack some of the relationship between masculinities and physics. And in looking at masculinities in physics, I consider I'm looking at multiple masculinities and also trying to tease out potential hierarchies between these different masculinities. But when working with the analysis, which to start with was very much focused just on gender, I didn't have any sort of intersectional, I didn't think of this as an intersectional study. But during the analysis, it became apparent that many of the students doing of physics also was intertwined with what could be understood as a doing of class. And this was in particular the case for male students with a working class background, who then often spontaneously during the interview brought issues of class and the class feeling of otherness to the interview conversation. And in the study then, class also became an important analytical category. And analytically, I conceptualized class then in a sort of parallel fashion to how I conceptualize gender, as a process then in which class positions, differences, and inequalities are socially constructed. So both class and gender then, in this way, is conceptualized as fluid and subjective, as produced in interactions between individuals and social structures. And finally, of course, I'm looking at intersections also of gender and class. So that's sort of the theoretical landscape. But let's meet some of the students. The analysis I will be presenting today draws on the full set of interviews, but in order to present sort of a more coherent story, I've chosen to focus on 4 of the students, so you will get to know 4 of them a bit better. These 4 I've chosen to call Paul, Cecilia, Kalle, and Ann. Paul is in his mid-30s. Prior to studying physics, he had worked a number of different sort of manual labor jobs. He'd experienced from plumbing and carpentering and all kinds of lines of work, really. And he found these experiences to be really useful for him as a physicist, physics student. And he was enrolled in an undergraduate degree program at the time of the interview. Cecilia, she was, at the time of the interview, in her mid-20s. She also, well, like all these students actually, came from a working class background. And she was doing a PhD in experimental physics. Kalle, he was in his late 20s. Prior to studying physics, he'd been working in the industry, and he was doing his master's, had just started his master's actually. Anne, she was in the late 30s. Prior to coming into the physics education, she had worked with electrical constructions, and she was doing a PhD at the time of the study. So as I mentioned before, this study is very much focused on laboratory work. And laboratory work is often then considered a very central part of university science education across the different sciences, in that it presents this unique opportunity to learn the essentials of scientifically based empirical activity. But also interestingly, for my study, is the complexity of this learning context, how the complexity of the lab as a learning environment makes them varying interpretations of the learning goals and this learning activity possible. And in the empirical data as a whole, one of the most notable dividing lines among the students were whether they considered practical skills as essential to laboratory work or not. Several of the students I've interviewed were very, very adamant that practical skills were of little or no importance in the physics laboratory, focusing then entirely on the importance of mathematical and analytical skills. But there were also students who took great pride in their practical abilities, and Paul was among them. So when I asked him what he saw himself as good at in the student laboratory, he immediately answered, connecting stuff. And then said, I'm fairly good at connecting things together, setting things up, getting the stuff working, starter measurements, and stuff like that. And Cecilia, she presents also an approach to laboratory works that is very, very, very similar to that of Paul's. Where she talks about how she worked in the student laboratory, so looking back at her experiences of the student laboratory, she said, I really sucked at preparation. It was always the last minute to read stuff through, just before. Well, when I'm doing laboratory work, I'm good at daring to press all the buttons, kind of. If you have an oscilloscope, haven't used an oscilloscope in 2 years, turn a bit here, turn a bit there. Oh, damn, look, a picture. So also this sort of trial and error approach to doing laboratory work. And there were also other student narratives where this kind of trial and error sort of approach was, we could say, valorized even more. And the reading of instructions were explicitly frowned upon. As a physics student, you should simply be able to figure out what to do in the laboratory without having to rely on instructions. And does this seem like something that university physics teachers might find problematic? Well, according to an anthropological study by Katrin Hasse, a Danish anthropologist who actually enrolled in an undergraduate physics program, not so much. Because several of the university teachers, many of the university teachers actually in her study, interpreted students having this very sort of strong hands-on approach to lab work, who did not follow instructions, but rather played around with the equipment as creative and independent, thus suitable for a career in physics. Sort of having a natural flair for physics. Whereas the ones who were seen as following the instructions were not seen as sort of the creative physicists. So very much a hidden curriculum about how you ought to be as a physics student. Kalle also found experimental physics very appealing. He had previously during the interview talked about how he is not at all interested in more theoretical aspects of physics. And when I ask him what he sees as so appealing with the experimental, he tells me that it's that you can come up with your solutions yourself, and then you get to manufacture these ideas then, even though it's not me who gets to do it, but the people in the workshop. But it's precisely that that's so appealing, that it's so close to working in a workshop. Quite a different story about this high-status discipline of physics that in fact what he finds so appealing with physics is that it's so close to working in a workshop. It so much resembles his previous experiences of industrial work. And similarly, Anne, the PhD student, also characterized her work as extremely experimental. That's how she described it herself. And also viewed her experiences then of working with electrical constructions as highly valuable to her PhD work. But while all these 4 students that I'm talking about today clearly then value their own practical skills and sees them as useful in the context of the physics laboratory, if we zoom in on Paul and Kalle, they view the status of these practical abilities within the physicist community very, very differently. Kalle, throughout the interview, returns to the importance of practical abilities, both in terms of how he himself does physics, but also in terms of how he thinks physics ought to be done. And he also actually positions himself very clearly in opposition to a laboratory approach focused on too much understanding. So he doesn't want to work with someone who's too analytical, because that takes valuable time away from doing the actual experiment, Kalle thinks. However, Kalle does recognize that this approach to lab work and the skills he brings with him from his previous experiences of industrial work does set him aside from most physicists. He says, at least now that I'm doing my master's research project, I can say that I work in a different way compared to who are ordinary scientists work, so to speak, especially since you get to do a lot of the tinkering yourself, which he was very happy that he was allowed to do. But clearly he here then positions himself as different than other physicists. And he also, during the interview, talks about possibly wanting to do a PhD in physics, but is not interested in continuing in academia beyond a possible PhD, so very much finds himself on an outbound trajectory within the physicist community of practice. Paul also, as I said, values his practical skills highly. But he has also experienced that these practical skills are not always highly valued within the physicist community. He talked to me about a course mate of his, Jörgen, who he'd been studying together with. And he says that Jörgen, he's kind of such that the theoretical is better than the practical, he thinks. And I can't say I think it is. Like that kind of knowledge is higher valued, I ask Paul. Paul says, yeah, he somehow seems to think that it's better to be a theoretician, or that it's better you should get away from all the manual work. And I can think that it has exactly the same value, because they are two sides of the same thing, kind of. It's good with theory, but if you can't tie it to the practical. But Paul is very much recognizing that the way he values his practical skills might not be as highly valued by other people within the physicist community of practice. He also gives other examples of this. And he also explains to me that he is very much interested in developing his analytical skills. And says that, I think that I'm better at analysis today after spending almost 3 years here. It's a small difference between connecting stuff, but I'm still somewhat better at connecting. I'm just working on that. Next year I will be just as skilled at analyzing as at connecting. So by trying then very deliberately to develop his analytical skills, Paul then is very much also aspiring to be on an inbound trajectory in the physicist community practice, negotiating then a kind of participation in physics, where he has to some extent complied with collective norms about importance of practical skills, yet then questioning this perceived devaluation of practical skills. But something that is clearly noticeable in these narratives about Paul and Kalle is how they, despite being men, and as such then often being assumed to have an unproblematic relationship to the discipline of physics, are involved in ongoing negotiations of how to fit into this discipline. And one interpretation of this could be that it is an effect of different masculinities being differently valued within different class contexts. Judy Weissman, who's done a lot of work on engineering and constructions of masculinities within engineering, she discusses two different engineering masculinities, namely an analytical and a technical masculinity. Where the analytical masculinity, then, she argues, is based on analytical competence and the professionalized calculative rationality, whereas what she calls technical masculinity then is based on physical toughness and mechanical skills. And the Swedish anthropologist Ulf Mellström, who has also studied engineers, found that male engineers across a variety of different engineering contexts viewed technical skills, the ability to take care then of a wide range of practical problems that may or may not be that applicable to your particular engineering context, as an important part of what it was to be, or what it meant to be a competent man for these engineers. And from this, Mellström argues that in Sweden, being practical has traditionally then been very highly valued, and is also tightly interconnected with being a man, in particular then in working class contexts. And while I do recognize that physics and engineering are not the same thing, I think this is also an argumentation that is valid in the physics community and can be transferred into these physicists' engineer negotiations. So, negotiating then a participation in physics, as these students are doing, drawing on the practical aspects of the discipline, can not only be seen as related, I would argue, to these students' experiences of working class jobs, but also as a doing agenda. As we've seen, the similarities between Anne's and Paul's and Cecilia's and Kalle's approaches to laboratory work, the way they construct themselves as physics students in the context of laboratory work, are notable. And to some extent, all four of them could be said to perform this technical masculinity that Weissman has described. And by drawing on the practical aspects of the physicist practice, all these four students also then were able to negotiate a participation in university physics, in which they were then holding on to technical skills they had very much learned to value in their working class backgrounds. So for them, practical skills became sort of a gateway into this high status discipline of physics. And in doing this negotiation then of a participation in physics that included these practical skills, while sometimes, in particular in Paul's case, trying to adapt also to a community that values certain middle-class values, analytical abilities, etc. You could think of them, or at least some of them, as enacting kind of a class hybridity that Diane Ray has talked about. And as we saw with Paul and Kalle, depending on how you view the importance of practical skills and how you sort of are able to renegotiate your own participation in physics, you might find yourself on more of an inbound or more of an outbound trajectory in this community. And if we move back to this earlier cited description from Kim Thomas, maybe there wasn't a conflict for Paul between being a man and being a scientist, but rather between how to be a man and how to be a scientist, how to be a man in science and how to be a man in a working class context. So for him, with his working class background, academic success was not normative. And Paul in many ways had to explicitly then enact himself as other in order to succeed in the physicist community. At least that's the way he was looking at it. And also in the interview with Anne, there were a lot of what could be interpreted as rather class negotiations of her participation in the physicist community going on. I asked her if she saw herself as a physicist. And she said, well, I am a physicist, but at the same time, I feel that I'm one of those amateurs. But they're needed too. You don't need to be a Nobel laureate in order to be a physicist. What does it mean to be an amateur then? I asked her. And she said, that you're not perhaps the most quick-witted genius. It's like Henrik and I talked about, my husband. And then he said, but if you go out into professional life and think the work is done by ordinary people, and then there is this clique of extremely smart, and they are often just difficult to deal with. And we both laugh. No, but jokes aside, she says, I'm more of that mediocre person, I think. But constructing herself as that more of that mediocre person in physics, very much then in contrast to this idea of physics as this elite subject that's not really accessible for everyone. I mean, I think she is really challenging that notion of physics here, because she is also constructing herself as very central to the physicist community. That her kind of being in physics is actually very important for the physics community, for it to function. But in negotiating her way of being in physics in this way, I think we can see this as sort of being a legworker of physics in a way. This is sort of falling back very much on her working class background, to some extent at least. But I'd like to say something about something more about these two women that I'm focusing on today in the sample, Anne and Cecilia. And during the interviews, both of them repeatedly described themselves as laddish, get up big in Swedish. They are distancing, I take notes, distancing themselves from all female context, and both of them are repeatedly stressing how they feel at home in male-dominated contexts, such as physics then. Anne says, for example, I like being among guys. I like the jargon and that attitude a lot of the time. I would be more nervous if it was only women. I've had a horse, you know. Only women in the stable. Not so easy, I can tell you. She is funny. It's a very funny interview to read. And this is very much in line with how others have noted that women within the male-dominated science and technology disciplines often position themselves as one of the boys. And thereby distancing themselves from traditional femininity that then is perceived as incompatible with doing science or engineering, for example. And in previous work, such distancing has often been seen as a way for these women to fit into their chosen science or engineering discipline, and sometimes also understood as a failure to challenge dominant gender norms, or even as an approach that's been more or less forced onto these women. But given the strong and positive identification of Anne and Cecilia with what we can then describe as this technical masculinity from Weissman, and how this way of doing physics also constitutes then for them a continuity to their previous experiences from their working class backgrounds, I would like to offer a different interpretation. Because first it can be noted that within science and mathematics in particular, science and mathematics, female students are often constructed as being very diligent, neat, rule-following and hard-working rather than talented. It's a very common story. So when Cecilia in this way then talks about her practice in the student laboratory as being characterized by this inadequate preparation and unafraid tinkering with the equipment, I would argue that that at least in part needs to be understood as a reaction towards that norm for female science students, well in line with how she describes herself as laddish. So by both done this explicit rejection of this rule-following approach to laboratory work, commonly then attributed to female students, but also by rejecting traditional femininity in more general terms. For example, she points out that how she was a typical engineering student who drank beer and sang indecent songs. So I think we can understand Cecilia to, in several ways, be performing what we could call female masculinity. And similarly, Anne has also, in the physics community, found an arena where her desired way of being is possible. She repeatedly, during the interview, stressed how she feels very much at home in physics. She also says that I can never be like normal women, so I feel very comfortable among guys. And this is something that comes back throughout the interview with her. And this is also well in line with the work of Alison Gonsalves, a Canadian ethnographer who studied PhD students in physics. And one of her informants, Ruby, she really struggled to be recognized as a physicist through the technical and analytical forms of confidence that were the typical forms of sort of currency in her department. But she was still able to assert an identity as a physicist. She really, throughout the interview with Alison, very strongly identified as a physicist, talked about herself as a physicist, by then positioning herself in opposition to a traditional femininity. And for example, she identified herself as a physicist by suggesting that her performances, as you can see in the first quote here, fit that of the eccentric physicist. So also for her, this becomes a way of finding a way of identifying with this discipline. So just some concluding thoughts. I think that in this interview data, there is an interesting ambiguity regarding the place for practical skills within the physicist community. It's definitely an important aspect of the versatility that is expected from an experimental physicist. But when associated too strongly with the doing of a working class masculinity, it also threatens to then make the students peripheral in the physicist community. And it's also interesting to reflect upon whether this highly embodied doing of physics that all these four students describe, sort of in some ways may be challenging the idealized portrayal of physics as objective, rational, and disembodied. It's a very different story these students tell. And as I said, this is work carried out within physics education research. And if you look at work that's usually done on gender within that field, and also many of the recruitment initiatives, it's very much focused on the women. It can be about trying to, in some ways, change the women to fit in better. You need to teach them certain practical skills, for example, that they are assumed to be lacking, or you need to change the physics in order for the physics to be more appealing to women. This is usually how sort of gender and physics is talked about. But I find it very important also to, in order to do this more nuanced analysis of different gender dimensions within the sciences, to focus also on the construction of masculinities, both as a means of scrutinizing the norm, looking into what are the norms in physics, but also as a way of nuancing them both men's and women's relationships to physics. So I agree with Helena Pettersson, who argued that perspectives from masculinity studies are central when analyzing gender dynamics within the science community. Interpreting gender, and specifically cultural aspects of masculinity, contribute to the understanding of the domination of men by rank and number within the physics community and science in general. So I think this is a field that is just starting to take off. There isn't a lot of work on masculinities within science, within physics. So a lot more work to be done, I think, and a lot of interesting work to be done. I could just mention that today's talk is partly based on 2 papers. The first paper is out in Cultural Studies and Science Education. The second paper, we hope that it's soon going to be out. It's under review and we've got minor revisions. But you may or may not see work by myself, Alison Gonsalves, and Helena Pettersson in Physical Review special topics sometime soon.
Sure. Okay, brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got plenty of time for discussion. We usually take 2 minutes just so people can get another drink if they want one, and so that Anna gets a 2-minute break, and so you can think of some questions. But then we've got a good half hour, 40 minutes for discussion and questions. So thank you. Let's get another drink. Yeah. We're about to get started again. Sorry to interrupt your conversations, but hopefully we'll continue interesting discussions. So anybody want to kick off with a question? Oh, lots of people. Okay, I think you were first up with your hand up.
Yeah, so case studies are interesting, but 22 case studies isn't a good sized statistical sample to be able to actually then extrapolate from those case studies to the wider population. So have you also done some kind of a survey? Because I think that a survey of, 1,000 people also backed up with case studies, which gives you a lot more information, and there's things that you could ask that you've done in the case studies that would be perfectly good on a large survey, like which of these statements about yourself do you identify with most closely? I am a girly girl. I am a laddish girl. I am a man. Which of these statements do you think best describes you? And these are things you could do like with 1,000 people, and then you'd have a big statistical sample that you could analyze.
Definitely a way to answer different kinds of questions, I would say.
I guess the reason I'm asking is that as a physicist, a lot of what you said I found shocking and I don't recognize. So I thought, could just be that your sample size is small.
I also have a specific sample size. The undergraduate students are not specific in terms of their specialization. They are specific in terms of studying at a university that has a strong tradition in experimental physics, and many of them might have gone to that university for that reason.
Right, so they're already self-selected.
They are self-selected. The university students, I didn't mention this, I go into much more detail about what kind of physics these people do when I talk at physics departments. They are people who self-define as experimental physicists. So that's also a selection in terms of these aren't all physicists.
Right.
These are a particular group of physicists. But that said, of course, you can get interesting things out of, in particular, I think, of a more mixed method kind of study where you base then a larger quantitative study on previous qualitative work. But I think also the kind of nuances you get in this kind of work, you can never get to in a large survey.
I agree with that.
And not just in terms of nuances, but also in terms of it takes a while for you to even start to think about these issues, to talk about these issues. Asking survey questions isn't going to put people in that mode, sort of. It took a long time before they started talking about the experiences related to class. Some of these interviews were 90 minutes long.
It's a really different time.
So these aren't necessarily things they were consciously aware of before the interview.
Right. So it wouldn't come out in a regular survey then?
I don't think it would come out in a regular survey.
Out of the conversation.
No, I think that would also give you very. It can be. There has been similar studies to what you suggest done. But what happens is also obviously that you get these very narrow boxes that you're supposed to put yourself in, and we can't be put into those narrow boxes. Obviously, we are doing a lot of different identity work at the same time, and we're just not one thing. And I think a lot of people would be rather uncomfortable ticking a box like that.
Sure, you're right. They think on which day.
Yeah, precisely.
I think it's quite a lot of questions. So I think there's someone on this side, and then Brett, Steve, and then Brett, and then Frida.
Thank you. I thought that was a very interesting presentation. I have a question in regards to sort of design with regard to intersectionality and also the sample that you presented to us. There is an issue there, I think, of age. I mean, as I look down your list, a lot of these people were 20s and 30s, had more, you know, diverse backgrounds and prior experience than potentially your traditional age 18, 19-year-old that goes straight from school or college into the into university. So I wonder, have you actually sampled younger students, and is there any sort of difference in the discourses they were using to describe their position with physics and those of the older students that you presented today?
Very, very interesting question. In the undergraduate student sample, I tried to have a variation in terms of ages, gender, also, those were the main things I was looking at. Yeah. But once class started to come out in the interviews as an important factor, that was also something I took into consideration in the sampling. So I do have your younger typical students as well. One of the reasons they're not in today's presentation is that some of them find it much more difficult to talk about these issues. Obviously, they haven't got as much experiences to draw on. They might not be as nuanced in their identity negotiations. But what they are saying is not going against what these 4 students I'm presenting today are saying. It's just that these students are saying it in a more nuanced and sort of eloquent way, which makes it good for presentations of this kind. And that said, also in Sweden we have a somewhat older student population. Right. So one of these were in her mid-20s. She has gone straight through school and then to university. Kalle, late 20s, yeah, been out working for a couple of years, but that's it. So we have, I think we have more mature students than in the UK.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. It was a really interesting talk. My question is really about whether the concept of class has been problematized to the same extent as the concept of gender in your talk, because you have quite a lot of gender stuff. For example, laddish females, right? That would be an example of problematization. When it comes to the class side of it, what I wonder is that there seems to be an argument that goes, it's very good that we have tinkering, for example, and that's part of the hidden curriculum. That relates to some prior experience, say, in carpentry, and therefore there's some kind of class identity going on. And it kind of makes me wonder what you mean by class, because, for example, to me, you could define working class as separation from ownership of the means of production. So carpentry is not itself an intrinsically working class thing to be doing. You could own your own small business doing carpentry. That's not as working class as, say, working in a factory where everything that you're doing is very much not tinkering, actually. If you're in the bottom layer of a factory, what you're doing is being told to exactly follow rules and not being given any space to tinker.
I've done exactly that.
So what I'm saying is that when you're tinkering in a physics lab, it's not like all kinds of working class work by any means. And I wondered whether there was any, you know, it depends, I suppose, what kind of background this carpentry or plumbing or these other things actually were. Yeah. I don't know that from the talk. But I wonder whether you ever got any hint from these people of what it was actually different about being in the physics lab tinkering versus what their life had been like in an industrial context.
First, I'm going to take a sort of easy route out of part of your question by saying that all these 4 students self-identified as working class. So that's sort of the starting point, that they talk about themselves as being working class. So that's one way of defining it. That said, I think the question you're asking is a very good one, and I think obviously you can't make these very simplified connections, and I think what they are doing obviously in the physics laboratory is very different. But somehow Kalle is very much able to use this metaphor of the laboratory as a workshop, as he's using the workshop almost as a boundary object in order to understand the physicist community, the physicist practice in terms of something he has previous experiences of, and he's bringing in selected previous experiences into that. I'm not saying you can equate the two, and I don't think that's what they're doing either. It's that they are using certain previous experiences, and it's just not from that particular working class job. I think, by the way, that the carpentering and plumbing that Paul had done had been very much of the working class kind. He had been employed, and he'd been doing it for someone else, and it's been. But in spite of that, he talked about being able to pick up a new job within just learning a new job in just a few months. Just do it, and that was something he saw as valuable then in physics as well. So I would encourage more work to tease out those nuances, definitely, and also, as I tried to be open with in the presentation, social class came in later into the analysis. That was something that came out of the empirical data, and therefore also it's not as theorized. But that's work I would very much like to do. Hi.
When you put your start of things with saying that Sweden is quite a sort of gender-neutral society, but then you have the, compared to countries. But then,
I didn't say gender-neutral.
Well, it's sort of, you expect, that it would be having a big in the other countries. But it did show that for physics, you have 95% professors being male, which is actually shocking, comparing with what we have as a statistic in the UK. So, do you have any ideas why it's that? Or any, do you see it as an issue?
That's $1 million question, isn't it? Short answer is no. I must admit. This figure of 95%, that is a few years old, and it's also the number of physics professors at that particular research intense university. So overall, you would have a somewhat high representation of women in physics.
Which is actually, if you're saying, if it's research intense, then the number of female is also quite
yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what the statistics are saying. I'm sorry, but
well, for UK is somewhere between 15-20%.
I think it's raising quite quickly in Sweden as more women are being promoted to professor.
More and more, like over the years, you can see the sort of improvement in those figures.
The improvement in the figures for undergraduate students are very slim in Sweden, at least. Very, very small improvements. And that's, but then that's not my expertise. So
we have similar problems in biology. And we're starting from an undergraduate base, which is predominantly female.
Yeah.
So we have trouble recruiting male undergraduates. But those male undergraduates that do recruit, we have a lot of trouble stopping them from becoming the next generation. So there's some kind of attritional process that's occurring within this. So when you start with majority male undergraduate and move to even more male-dominated peak.
But it's not as extreme as in biology.
Yes, it is. In biology, it's a complete over that, because in parity, 50-50 parity is sort of the PhD level. So graduate students, 50-50 parity, and after that it flips over. So I wonder if it's really discipline-specific, or whether there's something in the research structures, the business about getting a grant, doing publications and all that, which is common to different subjects, which nevertheless is somehow unequalizing the playing field.
Well, as someone in curriculum studies, I like to think that there are some things that are discipline-specific at least, otherwise I'm out of a job. But no, I mean, some kind of combination of the two, obviously, and I think biology is really, that is a field that's waiting to be more explored in terms of these issues. I think that's such an interesting case study where you have this flip from the majority of women in undergraduate to the extreme few professors, and that hasn't changed a lot over the years either. So you can't blame it on sort of a time lag, and it will catch up. So I think that's a study to happen, waiting to be done.
Thank you, everyone else, for an interesting talk. I was interested, the two, obviously...
Could you speak up just a bit?
Obviously, you presented to 4 students, which is only a small section of your case studies, and those 2 are female. But I noticed that all the women, or female students that you were presenting case studies of were self-identifying as laddish women. And that's then good. Did you make an effort to seek out those girly girls in the physics bunch and to look at sort of their interpretation of what it meant to be a physicist that was not identifiable as drinking beer and singing around songs? So I was very interested to hear a case study from a female student or a female physicist who was able to construct her identity as a physicist without reference to needing to be one of the boys or drinking beer.
Read Alison Gonsalves's work. She's got some of those in her sample. One, for example, who in very interesting ways is able to renegotiate what is good qualities to have in the physics lab by drawing on the very embodied notion of her small hands, and how that makes her more fit for certain things than, whereas there are other things she can't do because she physically can't reach across some of the German machinery they are using, whereas the Japanese experimental equipment is much more well suited for her body size. And they say that this is a disembodied science. Yeah, they're lying. And I also had women in my sample who wouldn't identify or who didn't identify as laddish. I had women in the sample who completely didn't want to talk about gender, which isn't too uncommon, who were very adamant that gender doesn't matter at all in any way.
Emily or Dawn, do you want to ask a question or make a comment? You don't have to, of course. I'm not putting you on the spot, but you're welcome to.
I was just fascinated by the gender and the class issue and wondered if different areas of physics attract different social classes, like particle physics or astrophysics. Do they attract different sort of classes or genders or mixture?
I'll just see if I got what you said. Do different areas of physics attract different students in terms of gender and class? And
yeah.
That was the question. Yeah. Okay. There isn't a lot of studies done to that sort of detailness. So all I could possibly give you is anecdotal evidence, and that's possibly not so interesting. But it's not difficult to think that what you're suggesting might be the case. And I mean, we know more generally that if you have a lot of women within the research group, that particular research group, irrespective of field almost, is going to attract more women. So that's probably the case in physics as well. But there aren't, as far as I'm aware, any studies done on that. More like, at least not larger quantitative studies. Want to collaborate?
Emmy, anything to comment or ask?
It's frozen. It looks very frozen.
Very frozen.
Yeah. So I have a question about the men and their seemingly unproblematic relationship with the discipline. And for that, I would like to use a popular culture example, which is the Big Bang Theory. So
I knew that would come up.
You just knew that it's going to come from.
No.
The characters are portrayed as like exactly what not a masculine is, right? They're like geeks, losers, playing computer games all day and everything. So that relates to the idea that ladism is actually equally problematic for men too, and I was just wondering if we accept ladism as a way of socialization into the discipline, which also speaks to the Levin-Winger idea, to what extent man is just also, changing themselves, just portray themselves as like a masculine, just to deal with this kind of stereotypical things, and what's the problem for men actually in this case? So it's in a sense that masculinity is bigger than what a maleness is or something like that. So could you speculate on that, or do you have any data on that, or did you even find it meaningful at all? Just
really interesting question, and can't really think of a good answer on the spot. I must say, but. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I can just guess as a male, I mean, I don't think any associated with a male discipline education is actually quite like biology maybe, but I don't know, I guess I just don't have any.
No, I do, I mean, obviously a lot of the men studying physics also have to do a lot of identity work in order to fit into that discipline that can be of different kinds. So, and really that's what I'm trying to question, that isn't that something that a lot of people need to do in order to fit into this discipline, whereas often it is taken for granted. The focus is so much on the women, the focus is so much on helping women to fit into physics, or making physics more appealing to women, that we're not looking at what the men are doing in the discipline in order to fit in. They are very much creating the norm for this discipline in this, if for no other reason, so because they are in such a quantitative majority. So what norms are they both producing and reproducing? And that's much further work.
If you read your book, it would be much better.
Just picking up on that, I wonder if within the UK, and wondering perhaps could say a bit more, we have a scheme called Athena Swan, which is about trying to look at different science subjects, physics included, in order to have a look at the sort of gender balance and think about certain initiatives. So actually there is often a focus, it seems, on looking at how things could change, arrangements could change, perhaps working practices, in order to make the discipline and the working practices more useful for women.
Yeah.
But as we start to change other practices, so just thinking if we change the maternity and paternity leave arrangements within the UK, within Lancaster, for instance, that would actually help some of the men to be able to engage in their role as a mother. And I just wondered if there's anything from your research or any of your findings that might have ideas for what might be done to either challenge or change and help men or women to engage in the science subject in a more balanced way.
That little question. I think that's not just one research project. That's I can spend, precisely. But something that is interesting in regard to that is how maybe in some of these initiatives, the sort of view of the disciplines we are working with can sometimes be an idealized or stereotyped version of what people from the outside think that the sciences are. So, I mean, that could be one starting point, at least, to try to look at what is actually useful skills to have in these disciplines, and what do people who are within the disciplines value, and what made the discipline attractive to them. Because as someone who comes from a physics background, I sometimes look at the way that physics is portrayed in these initiatives is very far removed from my own experiences of that discipline. These strongly embodied experiences are not visible. It's talked about as this very rational kind of discipline. Or you talk about the singular geniuses, whereas it's very much a teamwork, obviously. And So also look for that and look for what is actually the science practices today.
Yeah, but only if there's not other questions. It was chipping in again to the sort of thing that Murat had opened up really, and just a kind of I picked up on smartness, interest sort of coming out of this, and thinking about the kind of nuancing of masculinities and kind of positionings for men within physics, and the kind of way that the sort of practical versus theoretical can map onto masculine versus feminine, or there seemed to be something around the kind of devaluing of manual labour and practicality that isn't just about class, but is about, a sort of devaluing of what it is about.
Depends on your context, isn't it? Context depending on how those kind of skills would be gendered, or for that matter, classed.
But it struck me that there was a lot of pressure for men to be smart and.
But it's two different kinds of. I mean, it's smartness in both these realms here, really. I mean, it's also smartness in terms of being able to work with the equipment in a way that doesn't take instructions, for example. So on both those sides, you have different kinds of smartness.
Any more questions?
No, just continuing that really. I was just thinking about surgeons and dentists.
Yeah, very.
Hand skills, if you want to call them that. Except for Susan.
Very
Sorry, just what you just said, saying about surgeons and dentists, something that I've literally just yesterday was watching as part of my master's course, and it's looking at learning practice within healthcare, and a very interesting short clip which is about junior doctors and qualified, and the prevalence of it was predominant or majority male doctors still, and predominantly female nursing staff. That we saw in the clip. It wasn't talking about the gendered issues. But what I found very interesting was the practical aspect had obviously not been valued in their prior learning, because the entire of the nurses need to show them the practical skills for doing the experiential, how to load a syringe, how to fill in paperwork, so the familiarity with the tools and the identification of someone who does medicine as opposed to identification of someone who has studied medicine. And that's interlinking with what we've been talking about, the difference between analytical skills and the more practical skills within physics and maybe within the other STEM subjects. And if there's something about how those are valued across the board in all, cross-curricular things, is it seen that if you have a more practical focus on doing, that further academic study isn't necessarily the route for you to go, and does that then link into people's self-identification of class? You're saying that you need to go and do, and academic isn't a place where you do, that you therefore self-select out of that field without even thinking about capability in other grounds. But Francis just a very interesting area.
Also the contextualisation of masculinities. I mean, if you look at work by, for example, Mackingale, the idea of in sixth form and, the work that Carolyn and I've done at university, it's more about pushing people around with the mind. Masculinity is defined more so through mental prowess and possibly physical prowess. And I think maybe that has an element of it in, your more theoretical end of physics, where, being able to compute it brilliantly and effortlessly, again, effortless achievement might come into it more so than somebody who's just there pressing the buttons and not really sure of what they're doing. Perhaps.
Yeah, a lot of this effortless achievement is definitely a concept that comes in a lot into the way many of these physics students, I could have taken that as sort of another layer to how many of these students are positioning themselves, and how that is, well, as you've shown in your work, also what gives status for these physics students. And also coming back then to the idea of physics as this elite discipline that's not for everyone and that takes a certain natural talent.
The naturally gifted male.
Oh yeah, we got plenty of them.
Do you? Because I find them in such short supply.
Maybe that's a good note on which. So before we thank Anna again, I just want to say about the next seminar, which is 21st of October, which is next Wednesday, is it? Yeah. And it's Murat, whose title is Capitalising on Social Presence. So please come back next week to hear another fascinating talk. But before then, if we could thank Anna again for a really interesting
Another appeal before we all go that I represent or not, I don't represent. I've come along from Faculty of Health and Medicine, and because I'm doing the Atlas course, I'm hoping to attend more educational research seminars as part of my development in teacher training. But the other thing is that we have in FHM, we have a teaching and learning forum, which is, although it's open to everybody, it's essentially intended as an internal forum for encouraging educators, and we're looking for a slot to fill sometime after Easter, and I thought it'd be a nice idea if we could get something about educational research into our curriculum, because some people feel that all we do is we run seminars about how to give a lecture and so on, you know, how to use Moodle and other practical stuff like that, but I'd like to be able to open the eyes of my colleagues to the fact that education is, like everything else, a research discipline, and that there is cutting-edge stuff going on, and that as scientists they might actually find it interesting to hear about research in something that isn't science. So if anybody wants to give a seminar or would like to give a seminar, then I'll circulate via Anne-Marie, I'll circulate something to ask again via email, and then I'll check back with my colleagues on the teaching and learning forum, and we can maybe book a slot for somebody if you'd like. You talk about anything as long as it's just educational research. We don't really care about particular subject matter. Just to show that there is such a thing as educational research. I think that a lot of people really don't grasp that fact in other disciplines. So that's what we do.
Okay, thank